In a world where ambition and power often collide, Matthew Hayes finds himself at the center of a fierce battle to protect his company and his future. As rumors swirl and betrayals come to light, Matthew must navigate a web of deceit, all while questioning his own heart. Between fierce business battles and unexpected moments of vulnerability, he discovers that true strength lies not in the battles won, but in the relationships he builds along the way. This is a story of resilience, redemption, and finding love when you least expect it. Matthew Hayes sat at his usual corner table at Cozy Cafe. His sharp blue suit, slightly wrinkled after a long day of meetings, caught the light of the evening sun that streamed through the tall windows. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, blending with the soft hum of jazz playing in the background. He glanced at his watch for the third time in 10 minutes, the polished surface glinting in the fading sunlight. A deep sigh escaped his lips. It was his 30th birthday, a milestone that seemed to highlight just how empty his life felt. Another year older, another year spent chasing the illusion of success, yet his heart felt emptier than ever. The jingle of the cafe door drew his attention, but it wasn't David. Matthew leaned back in his chair, trying to suppress the growing annoyance. He had rearranged his entire packed schedule to meet his childhood best friend, but now it seemed David had forgotten about the importance of today. Matthew glanced at the empty chair across from him, his mind racing with frustration. "Excuse me, sir. Would you like a refill?" A voice startled him. He looked up to see a young woman holding a coffee pot, her auburn hair tied back in a loose braid. Her uniform was plain, but her warm smile stood out against the dull backdrop of his day. "Sure, thanks," Matthew replied, pushing his cup closer. She poured the coffee gracefully, her hand steady despite the hustle of the busy cafe. "Long day?" she asked, her tone light but genuine. "You could say that," he replied, forcing a polite smile. He hesitated before adding, "Actually, it's my birthday. I was supposed to meet a friend, but I guess plans changed." Her eyes widened in surprise. "Happy birthday. Spending it here, though, that's unique." "It wasn't the plan," Matthew gestured toward the empty chair. "But I guess life has a sense of humor." She laughed softly. "Well, happy birthday anyway. I hope the day surprises you in a good way before it's over." "Thanks," Matthew replied, offering a faint but genuine smile. As she walked away, Matthew found himself oddly comforted by the brief exchange. His mind wandered back to the window, watching the world pass by on the other side of the glass. The rhythmic tapping of his fingers on the table betrayed his growing frustration. His phone buzzed. He grabbed it, filled with a mix of hope and resignation. It was a message from David. "Matt, I'm so sorry, man." David's voice came through the line, muffled and hurried. "Something came up at the restaurant. One of my chefs didn't show, and I'm slammed tonight. Rain check." Matthew's jaw tightened. "Yeah, sure. Don't worry about it." His tone was measured, but the sting was undeniable. "Thanks, buddy. I owe you one," David replied, oblivious to the disappointment he had just deepened. Matthew hung up without another word and set the phone down harder than he intended. He rubbed his temples, his mind swirling with thoughts he couldn't quite pin down. 30 years old, a successful career, a penthouse apartment, a fiancée whose beauty turned heads wherever they went. Yet here he was sitting alone on his birthday, feeling emptier than ever. "Excuse me," LLA's voice interrupted his thoughts again, softer this time. "I noticed you didn't touch your coffee. Everything okay?" Matthew glanced up, surprised by her attention. "Yeah, just thinking too much, I guess." She tilted her head slightly, her curiosity evident. "Big thoughts for a big day?" "Something like that," he said, his lips quirking into a half-smile. Before she could respond, the cafe door swung open again, and a group of lively customers filled the space with chatter. LLA gave him an apologetic glance and moved to greet the newcomers. Matthew took a long sip of his coffee, letting its warmth spread through him. He watched LLA move effortlessly around the cafe, her demeanor kind and unhurried despite the growing demands. There was something refreshing about her, something that stood in stark contrast to the polished, calculated world he inhabited. His phone buzzed again, pulling him back to reality. This time, it was a message from Charlotte. "Happy birthday, darling. Can't wait to see you this weekend. Love you." The words felt hollow, as they always did. Charlotte had sent the same generic text for the past 3 years, always delivered with perfect timing but devoid of true sentiment. He typed a brief response and set the phone down, his gaze returning to LLA. She was laughing with a customer, her genuine smile reaching her eyes. A pang of envy hit him. How long had it been since he'd laughed like that? With no reservations or pretenses. Before he could delve deeper into his thoughts, LLA returned to his table, a small plate in her hands. "On the house," she said, setting a slice of chocolate cake in front of him. "What's this?" Matthew asked, genuinely surprised. "Consider it a birthday gift," she shrugged. "Everyone deserves a little something sweet on their day." For the first time that evening, Matthew's smile reached his eyes. "Thank you, LLA. That's really kind of you." "It's just cake," she said with a playful wink, but her expression softened. "Hope it helps a little." As she walked away again, Matthew stared at the slice of cake, his chest tightening with unexpected emotion. It wasn't the cake itself, it was the gesture. Small, simple, and entirely without expectation. It had been a long time since anyone had done something for him without wanting something in return. The cafe's hum softened as the evening wore on, and Matthew found himself lingering long after he had finished the cake. When he finally stood to leave, he approached the counter to settle his bill. "LLA," he said, catching her attention. "Thanks for the cake, the coffee, and just for being you, I guess." She looked surprised, but her smile returned. "You're welcome. Have a good night, Matthew. And happy birthday again." As he stepped out into the cool night air, Matthew felt a strange mix of emotions. The hollow ache was still there, but it was tempered by something else. Something quieter, warmer. He glanced back at the cafe, the light spilling onto the sidewalk, and wondered if maybe, just maybe, the day had surprised him after all. Tomorrow would be another grind. Another day spent climbing the never-ending ladder. But tonight, he allowed himself to savor the faint flicker of hope that maybe, somewhere in the simplicity of moments like these, he could find something real. Something lasting. The city buzzed around him as he walked toward his car, the night full of unanswered questions and possibilities. The soft chime of his apartment elevator felt almost deafening in the stillness of the night. Matthew stepped into his penthouse. Its sleek, modern design cold and impersonal, despite the breathtaking view of Chicago's glittering skyline. He set his key on the marble counter and poured himself a glass of scotch. The amber liquid caught the dim light as he swirled it absently, staring out at the city. His phone buzzed on the counter, pulling him from his thoughts. It was another message from Charlotte. "Hope you had a wonderful day, love. Don't forget about brunch with my parents on Sunday." He frowned, the tension in his chest tightening. Charlotte's texts always felt more like reminders than genuine conversation. More like checking a box. With a deep sigh, he downed the scotch in one gulp and placed the glass down harder than he intended. The hollow clink echoed in the empty space. The weight of the day lingered as he loosened his tie and slumped onto the leather couch. His thoughts drifted back to LLA. Her genuine warmth had been a stark contrast to Charlotte's polished perfection. LLA had laughed with her whole being, her kindness unguarded. The way she had noticed his mood and offered the cake, it was so simple, yet it had touched him deeply. The sound of his ringtone jarred him, and he fumbled for the phone, surprised to see his father's name on the screen. "Dad," he answered, trying to mask the exhaustion in his voice. "Happy birthday, son." "I trust it was productive." Richard Hayes's voice was firm as always. Matthew smirked bitterly. Even his birthday was about productivity. "It was fine, Dad. Thanks for calling." "Good. Listen, we need to talk about Charlotte." Richard's tone shifted, the weight of expectation clear in his voice. "What about her?" Matthew sat up straighter, a familiar tension creeping into his shoulders. "You've been engaged for nearly 2 years now. It's time to finalize things. Her family is influential, Matthew. You know how valuable this alliance could be for the business." "I didn't realize my engagement was a corporate merger," Matthew said, his voice sharp. Richard sighed, the sound crackling through the line. "Don't be dramatic. You and Charlotte are a good match. She understands our world, our lifestyle. You need someone like her by your side." Matthew clenched his jaw, his father's words reigniting a frustration that had simmered for months. "Dad, I don't even know if she loves me for who I am or for what I have." There was a long pause on the other end. "That's nonsense, Matthew. Charlotte is devoted to you. Stop doubting everything and focus on what's important." The line went dead, leaving Matthew staring at the phone in his hand. He let it drop onto the couch beside him, his heart pounding. He knew his father's intentions were rooted in the business, always the business. But Matthew couldn't shake the growing doubt that Charlotte's love wasn't real, that it was just as transactional as his father's ambitions. The following morning, Matthew arrived at Hayes Real Estate's headquarters downtown. The building's imposing facade of glass and steel reflected the busy streets below, a testament to the empire his family had built over 3 generations. Margaret Blake, the company's sharp CFO, was already waiting for him in his office, her tablet in hand. "Good morning, Matthew," she said briskly. "Happy belated birthday. I assume you've seen the Q3 projections I sent last night." Matthew nodded, sitting behind his sleek desk. "Yes, Margaret. They look solid. But I need to talk to you about something else." Her brow furrowed slightly as she sat across from him. "What's on your mind?" "I need your help with a personal matter," he said, hesitating. Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Personal? That's not like you, Matthew." "I know," he admitted. "But this is important. I need to know if someone in my life is genuine." She leaned back, her gaze narrowing. "Charlotte?" Matthew nodded. "I'm not sure. Of cookies made just for you. I hope I'm not intruding," she added, her voice gentle and genuine. Matthew felt an unexpected warmth wash over him, the tension of the evening fading for a moment. He shook his head, a smile forming on his lips. "No, not at all. You're welcome anytime." He stepped aside to let her in. Lila entered, her presence light and comforting. She handed him the bag, and Matthew took it with a grateful nod. "Thank you, Lila. This is really kind of you." She smiled, her eyes bright with sincerity. "You're welcome. I thought you might need a little sweetness tonight." They both walked to the kitchen, and Lila set the bag down on the counter. She looked around the sleek, minimalist space. "It's beautiful, but I can tell this place isn't the home you really want." Matthew let out a quiet laugh. "It's just a place. It's got all the right features, but it feels cold." Lila turned to face him, her gaze soft. "I get that. Homes should be full of warmth, not just marble and steel." He nodded, taking a deep breath as the weight of his thoughts started to lift. For the first time in a while, he felt a sense of ease. Lila's presence was the opposite of everything he had been feeling. Genuine, unpretentious, and comforting. "I don't know if I've ever said it, but you really have a way of making things feel less complicated," he said, leaning against the counter. Lila smiled, a soft laugh escaping her lips. "I guess it's just about showing up, you know? Life doesn't need to be so complicated if we're kind to each other." Matthew took a moment to let her words sink in. The day's earlier confusion, the ache he felt inside, seemed to dissipate a little with each passing second. Maybe it wasn't about grand gestures or perfection. Maybe it was simply about kindness, the way she had shown up for him when he least expected it. She pulled a chair out from the kitchen table and sat down, crossing her legs. "So tell me about your day. You look like you could use a good distraction." Matthew hesitated, the events of the evening swirling in his mind. But looking at Lila, he felt an openness that he hadn't allowed himself to experience in a long time. "It's been a lot," he said, sitting down across from her. "Sometimes I feel like I'm living in a world where everything's a transaction, you know? Like my life is more about deals than about real connections." Lila nodded, listening intently. "It sounds exhausting." "It is," Matthew admitted. "And it's hard to tell who's really there for me, or if they're just looking for what I can offer." Her gaze softened, her voice gentle. "I think it's important to know what you want, Matthew. Not just in business, but in life. Who do you want around you? Who makes you feel, like you're actually seen?" He looked at her, the question hanging in the air between them. Lila didn't pressure him to answer right away. She simply waited, her eyes kind and patient. Matthew exhaled, feeling a release of tension he hadn't realized he was holding. I don't know. Something real, I guess. Something that isn't about status or appearances, or what people think they can gain from me." Lila smiled softly, her expression warm and understanding. "That's a good start. It's not easy, but it's the right kind of thinking." They sat there in comfortable silence for a few moments, the weight of the world outside temporarily forgotten. The aroma of the bread and cookies filled the air, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Matthew allowed himself to simply be. After a while, Lila stood up and started to unpack the bread and cookies, placing them on the counter. "Want to try the bread? It's still warm." Matthew nodded, his stomach reminding him that it had been hours since his last meal. As he cut into the loaf, he felt a sense of gratitude for this simple moment. Something that felt real, something that felt like it could last. They spent the next hour talking about everything and nothing, with Lila sharing funny stories from her day, and Matthew slowly letting go of the frustration that had been building inside him. She wasn't a solution to all his problems, but her kindness was a balm, a reminder that there were still simple, good things in the world. When she finally stood to leave, Matthew walked her to the door, the warmth of the evening still lingering. "Thanks again for this," he said. "It really meant a lot." Lila smiled, her eyes bright with genuine care. "Anytime, Matthew. You deserve a little sweetness now and then." As she walked down the hall, Matthew closed the door behind her, feeling the quiet settle over him. The city outside was still buzzing with its usual energy, but inside his penthouse, things felt different. Softer. Less lonely. Maybe, just maybe, he thought, the simplicity of moments like these were the things that truly mattered. And perhaps in time, they would lead him to something real, something lasting. He sat back down on the couch, a sense of peace settling in. The world would keep turning, the grind would continue, but tonight he allowed himself to just be. And that, for now, was enough. "I figured banana bread and some homemade jam might cheer you up," Lila said as she entered, her tone light and casual. Matthew chuckled softly, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You didn't have to go through the trouble." "It wasn't any trouble," she replied, stepping into the kitchen when he gestured her in. "Honestly, I bake when I'm stressed. Consider yourself a lucky recipient." Her nonchalant attitude eased some of the tension Matthew had been carrying. For the first time that evening, he felt himself relaxing. "Rough day for you too, huh?" she asked as she set the bag on the kitchen counter, glancing around at the sleek, minimalist design of the penthouse. "Yeah, you could say that," he admitted, his eyes flicking over the space. "This place is intense. Not a single knick-knack or cozy corner in sight." "Guilty," Matthew said with a grin. "Guess I never got around to making it feel like home." Lila glanced back at him, her expression softening. "Maybe you're too busy building homes for everyone else." Her words hit closer to home than she likely realized. He paused, trying to push the thought away as she unwrapped the banana bread and began slicing it. As he grabbed plates and set them on the counter, the simple act of sharing food in this casual moment caught him off guard. It felt easy, comforting, and different. "So," Lila began, her voice light but curious. "I saw the news. Hayes real estate restructuring? Is that as bad as it sounds?" Matthew stiffened slightly, but kept his expression neutral. "It's complicated. The market's been tough." Lila nodded thoughtfully, not missing a beat. "I get that. It's been a tough year for a lot of people. But if anyone can turn things around, it's you, right?" Her unwavering confidence in him made him pause. There was no trace of judgment, no trace of fear, just a quiet belief in his ability. "I hope so," he replied, his tone softer. They carried their plates to the living room and settled onto the couch. Lila tucked her legs underneath her, balancing her plate on her knee. "So tell me, what do you do when you're not saving the real estate world?" Matthew smirked. "You mean when I'm not buried in contracts and spreadsheets?" "Exactly," she said with a grin. "I used to play guitar," he admitted, surprising himself with the honesty. "Haven't touched it in years, though." Lila's eyes lit up. "No way! You're one of those mysterious business types who secretly write songs about heartbreak, aren't you?" "Something like that," he said, laughing. "What about you? Besides baking and making everyone's day better?" Matthew asked. Lila's smile faltered slightly, and she glanced down at her plate. "I'm trying to save up to open my own bakery. It's been my dream since I was a kid, but life keeps getting in the way." Matthew studied her for a moment, noting the flicker of vulnerability in her eyes. "Life has a way of doing that," he said quietly. "But you're the kind of person who makes things happen. I can see it." She looked up at him, a mixture of gratitude and surprise in her expression. "Thanks, Matthew. That means a lot." The conversation flowed effortlessly after that. The city lights cast a soft glow through the windows, and for the first time in a long while, Matthew felt truly present. When Lila finally stood to leave, Matthew walked her to the door. She turned to him before stepping out, her expression thoughtful. "You know, I think you're doing better than you give yourself credit for." "Thanks, Lila," he said genuinely. "And thanks for the bread. You might have just ruined store-bought for me forever." She laughed, the sound light and musical. "Glad to be of service. Good night, Matthew." "Good night." As the door clicked shut behind her, Matthew leaned against it, his mind racing. Lila was nothing like Charlotte. Her warmth, her kindness, her sincerity, it was all so refreshing, but also terrifying. His phone buzzed again. Another message from Charlotte: "We need to talk. Call me when you can." Matthew stared at the message, his jaw tightening. He knew this conversation was inevitable, but it wouldn't change anything. He set the phone down and headed to bed, his thoughts lingering on Lila's laughter and how it had made the world feel just a little brighter. New York City was always in motion, a constant sea of lights and sounds that never ceased. But inside Matthew's luxurious penthouse, the world seemed still, as though time had bent under the weight of the thoughts that tormented him. It was a typical morning, cold, dreary, with the relentless patter of rain against the windows. Yet the tension in the air was undeniable. The sound of his phone buzzing on his desk brought him back to reality, but he hesitated before reaching for it. He knew exactly who was trying to get in touch with him. Charlotte. Her name had been haunting his mind incessantly, like a shadow he couldn't shake. They had started this journey together, or so he thought, but now things had become too complicated. The company, his personal life, the secrets that seemed to intertwine more and more every day. And Victor, the man who seemed more interested in destroying everything Matthew had built than resolving any dispute. And now, the growing tension with Charlotte, who always seemed more concerned about her father's future than theirs. With a sigh, Matthew unlocked his phone and glanced at the message. It was short, direct as always. "Matthew, we need to talk. I don't know what to think anymore. You need to help me understand what's going on. I spoke to my father and he's worried. Call me." It was impossible to ignore the weight of those words. Not just for what they were saying, but for how the message felt. Charlotte was desperate, or at least that's how he interpreted it. That didn't mean he would give in, but somehow, it stirred something in him. Before he could process the message any further, the door to his office opened with a sharp click, and Margaret entered. She was always the most efficient of his executives, but today her expression was sharper than usual. Something was clearly happening. "Victor. He's doing what we expected," Margaret said bluntly before Matthew had a chance to speak. She sat down in front of him, without ceremony, and began to explain. "He's been spreading rumors about the company's stability. It's subtle, but it's clear he's trying to sow doubt. And the clients are starting to ask questions. He's trying to undermine your position, Matthew. Make no mistake, he's playing dirty." Matthew clenched his jaw, trying to stay calm. He knew he was being attacked from all sides. But it wasn't just the company that was at risk, it was his life, his future, the loyalty he thought he had with the people around him. His name no longer meant what it used to. "What can we do to counter this?" Matthew asked, his voice cold and calculating. He was already thinking through his options, but he needed a plan. "First thing you need to do is face it head-on," Margaret replied, crossing her arms. "Victor won't stop until he gets what he wants. You need to find a way to neutralize him before it's too late. And as for Charlotte, if she keeps going down this path, maybe it's time to think about whether this relationship is even worth fighting for." Margaret's words hit Matthew like a punch to the gut. The relationship with Charlotte was a tightrope, and he knew it. They were growing apart more with each passing day, and that was starting to bleed into his professional life. The pressure was reaching a breaking point. "I'll handle it," Matthew said firmly, his eyes fixed on Margaret. He knew there was no more room for subtlety. "And Victor? I'll handle him too." Margaret nodded, though her gaze was filled with concern. "Just be careful, Matthew. He's more dangerous than you think." As Margaret left his office, Matthew remained behind, his mind racing. He knew he had to act, and act quickly. There was no more time to waste. If he didn't move now, everything he had built could crumble around him. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. Meetings, phone calls, and reports flooded in, but none of it mattered. The real battle was waiting for him later that evening, his meeting with Victor. That was when everything would come to a head. The stakes had never been higher, and he knew that. The upscale restaurant downtown was the setting for the evening's meeting, a sleek, sophisticated place where high-stakes deals were often made under the guise of casual conversation. Matthew arrived early, still processing everything that had happened today. The restaurant was dimly lit, modern and elegant, providing the perfect backdrop for power plays and veiled threats. He spotted Victor almost immediately, sitting at a corner table, nursing a glass of red wine and scrolling through his phone as if he owned the place. Matthew approached, his expression unreadable. "Matthew," Victor said smoothly, standing to shake his hand. "I wasn't sure you'd come. You made it impossible to refuse." "Perhaps I underestimated your ability to manipulate," Matthew replied, his voice calm but laced with ice. "But I don't need you, Victor. And I'll do whatever it takes to prove that." Victor chuckled softly, his smile predatory. "Everything is a negotiation, Matthew. And you're about to learn that the hard way." They sat, and a waiter appeared almost immediately, taking their orders with practiced efficiency before vanishing again. Victor swirled his wine, his eyes fixed on Matthew as he leaned forward, clearly ready to play his hand. "Let's not waste time," Victor said, his tone smooth and calculated. "I've been hearing troubling things about Hayes' real estate, and as someone with shared interests, I thought it prudent to address them." "Shared interests?" Matthew asked, raising an eyebrow. "Is that what you call undermining my company behind my back?" Victor chuckled, but it was a dry sound devoid of warmth. "Undermining? Hardly. I'm simply protecting my investments, and by extension, Charlotte's future. Surely you can understand that." Matthew leaned forward, his voice cold but steady. "What I understand is that you're meddling in things you don't fully grasp. The company is fine, Victor. Whatever rumors you've heard are exaggerated." Victor's smirk didn't falter. "Perhaps, but perception is everything in business, isn't it? If people believe Hayes' real estate is unstable, it doesn't matter what the truth is. The damage will already be done, and you'll be the one holding the match." Matthew shot back, his voice low but firm. "And you're the one trying to light it." Victor's smile wavered slightly, but he recovered quickly. "Careful, Matthew. You may think you're in control, but alliances are fragile. And Charlotte, she deserves security. Stability. If you can't provide that, perhaps it's time to reevaluate your priorities." Matthew's stomach churned, but he didn't let it show. "Charlotte's security isn't your concern, or your bargaining chip. This isn't a negotiation, Victor." Victor leaned back in his chair, a knowing smile returning to his lips. "Everything is a negotiation, my boy. You do well to remember that." The waiter returned, cutting through the tension with plates of food that neither of them touched. The air between them was charged with unspoken threats, each man carefully choosing his words to maintain an edge. The conversation shifted to safer topics, market trends, mutual acquaintances, but the tension never fully dissipated. Matthew's phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking the fragile silence. He glanced at the screen and saw Lila's name. The sight of it steadied him, a brief anchor in the storm. Victor noticed the glance and tilted his head. "Important call." Matthew slid the phone back into his pocket, his expression unreadable. "Nothing that concerns you." Victor chuckled softly, clearly amused. "Of course not." Later that night, Matthew found himself driving toward Lila's neighborhood. He hadn't planned to see her, but after his meeting with Victor, he needed something real. The cafe was closed, its windows dark, but he noticed a faint light spilling from a small storefront a few doors down. The faint scent of sugar and vanilla wafted through the air, pulling him closer. He stepped inside to find Lila bustling around a makeshift kitchen, her hair tied back, flour dusting her cheeks. When she looked up, she was startled, but then her face broke into a wide smile. "Matthew," she said, setting down a tray of cookies. "What are you doing here?" "I was in the neighborhood," he said softly. "Thought I'd check in." "Well, you caught me in my natural habitat." She laughed, gesturing to the trays of baked goods. "I'm catering an event tomorrow, and thought I'd get a head start." Matthew leaned against the counter, watching her work. "Do you ever take a break?" "Not really," she admitted, her tone light but honest. "But it's worth it. This is what I love." He nodded, her simple words grounding him. Lila had a way of making everything seem more manageable. "Lila," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of his thoughts. "Do you ever feel like you're fighting a battle you can't win?" She paused, meeting his gaze with quiet understanding. "All the time," she said softly. "But you keep fighting anyway. Because some things are worth it." Her words hung in the air, and for the first time in weeks, Matthew felt a glimmer of clarity. He didn't know what the future held. Victor's threats, Charlotte's loyalty, the company's stability, but he knew one thing for certain. Lila was worth fighting for. As she handed him a cookie and teased him about his inability to bake, the storm in his mind calmed, if only for a moment. And in that moment, Matthew knew he wasn't ready to give up, not on his company, and certainly not on what he was starting to feel for her. The battles were far from over, but maybe, just maybe, he was finally ready to face them head-on. The gala continued to swirl around Matthew as the night drew on, but inside, the tension was suffocating. The soft classical music, the laughter, and the clinking of glasses seemed like background noise as he stood in the corner, watching Charlotte interact with the city's elite. The glimmers of her silver gown under the chandelier lights were captivating, but her presence in his life had become a heavy weight, dragging him deeper into a web he wasn't sure how to escape. Charlotte had insisted she didn't know the extent of her father's actions, but the doubts gnawed at Matthew's mind. He could see it in her eyes, the faint hesitation when she spoke of her father's concerns, as if she were trying to walk a fine line between loyalty and practicality. The uncertainty that lingered between them was palpable, and the deeper he delved into it, the more he realized that even his trust in her was beginning to erode. Victor was the other looming presence. Matthew had expected confrontation, but nothing could prepare him for the calculated malice behind Victor's words. Every move Victor made was carefully designed to push Matthew closer to the edge, all while presenting himself as the savior in the eyes of the people. It was a dangerous game, and Matthew was the one trapped in the middle. What Victor was doing wasn't just a personal attack. It was a full-on assault on everything Matthew had built, on the reputation of Hayes Real Estate, and on his own future. As the night unfolded, Matthew's phone buzzed with a message from Margaret. The urgency in her tone was clear. Found something. Need to meet. Urgent. His heart skipped a beat, the tension he'd been carrying for months now tightening in his chest. He couldn't ignore it, not with everything on the line. He slipped away from the crowd and made his way to the West Lounge, his mind already racing with the implications of what Margaret might have uncovered. He had no illusions about the severity of the situation. When he entered the quiet lounge, Margaret was already there, waiting by the window. Her tablet was in hand, her face grim. The moment the door shut behind him, she wasted no time. "Victor's not just spreading rumors," she said, her voice low, her eyes locked onto his. "He's positioning himself to poach our biggest clients. He's offering lower rates, faster turnarounds, and throwing in incentives to sweeten the deal. He's portraying himself as the safer bet, while making you look like a liability." Matthew's stomach twisted as he absorbed the news. This wasn't just sabotage. This was a full-blown strategy to undermine everything he had fought for. The knowledge that Victor was using Charlotte's family as leverage made the situation even worse. Charlotte, who had already been wavering between loyalty to her father and her connection to him, was now caught in the crossfire of a battle that could destroy everything. "Does the board know?" Matthew asked, his voice barely a whisper, as if saying it aloud would make it real. "Not yet," Margaret replied, her voice tight. "But if this goes public, it could destroy everything. We need to act fast." Matthew was silent for a moment, the weight of the decision crushing him. His mind raced with possibilities, but none of them offered a clear path forward. The future of Hayes Real Estate hung in the balance, and it was clear that the battle wasn't just corporate, it was personal. The emotions tangled within him were no longer just about business, they were about survival. He couldn't allow Victor to destroy everything he had built. He couldn't allow Charlotte's family to tear them apart either. "I'll handle it," he said finally, his voice steady, despite the storm brewing inside him. "Keep this between us for now. I'll confront Victor directly." Margaret nodded, but her concern was evident in her eyes. "Be careful, Matthew. This isn't just business anymore. It's personal." The tension was unbearable as Matthew walked back to the ballroom. His every step felt heavier, the weight of Margaret's revelation pressing on his shoulders. His gaze swept over the crowd, but it was like walking through a haze. He could feel the distance between him and Charlotte, the fragile thread that still connected them unraveling before his eyes. When he spotted her near the auction tables, laughing and chatting with a group of donors, it felt like she was miles away. Her laughter sounded hollow to him now, like a carefully crafted performance designed to cover up the cracks that were slowly forming in their relationship. He had seen that facade before, but this time he wasn't sure if he could trust it. "Charlotte," he called, his voice cutting through the conversation. She turned, her smile faltering for just a second before she quickly recovered. "Everything okay?" she asked, her voice laced with concern, though Matthew could sense the hesitation behind it. "Can we talk?" he asked, his tone firm. He didn't have the luxury of pretense anymore. She glanced at the group of donors she was speaking with before nodding and following him to a quieter corner of the room. Her eyes were full of questions, but Matthew couldn't afford to soften the blow. The truth needed to be said, and it needed to be said now. "How much do you know about what your father's been doing?" Matthew asked, his voice low but insistent. Charlotte's brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean?" "Don't play dumb," Matthew replied, his voice growing sharper. "He's sabotaging my company, undercutting my clients, spreading lies about me. And I need to know if you're involved." Her eyes widened in genuine shock. "Matthew, I had no idea. I swear." Matthew studied her, searching her face for any sign of deception. He wanted to believe her, truly, but there was something in his gut telling him that trusting her completely might be a mistake. "I want to believe you," he said slowly, "but if you're keeping anything from me, anything that could change how I see this, I need to know now." "I'm not," she insisted, her voice trembling. "I had no idea. I'll talk to him. I'll fix this." As she spoke, Matthew's heart sank. The damage had already been done. Even if she was telling the truth, the trust that had been so carefully built between them was starting to crumble. And as the night wore on, Matthew knew the battle for his company and his future was only just beginning. Back in his penthouse, the rain tapped rhythmically against the windows. The glow of city lights painted the room in streaks of gold and silver. But despite the beauty of the view, Matthew felt a heavy weight on his shoulders. The stakes had never been higher, and every decision he made now would be critical to the outcome of this war. His phone buzzed, cutting through the silence. It was Lila. He stared at the screen for a moment, his mind still racing. He had always found comfort in her presence, but tonight, even that felt distant. Still, something inside him pushed him to answer. "Hey," he said, his voice softer than usual. "It's been a long night." "I was thinking about you," Lila replied, her tone tentative. "You seemed a little off last time we talked." Matthew leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "Yeah, it's been a lot." "Want to talk about it?" she offered. "Or I can just listen. Sometimes it helps." Her sincerity was like a balm to his frayed nerves. He wasn't ready to divulge everything. Not the sabotage, not the looming bankruptcy, not the weight of Victor's threats. But he found himself spilling the emotions he had kept bottled up for so long. "It feels like everything I've built is slipping through my fingers," he admitted, his voice cracking. "No matter how hard I try, someone's always there, waiting to tear it down." There was a pause on the other end. Then Lila spoke with calm conviction. "Matthew, you're one of the most determined people I know. If anyone can handle this, it's you." Her confidence in him felt like a lifeline, something he could cling to when everything else felt like it was falling apart. "Thanks, Lila. You have no idea how much I needed to hear that," he said, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Well, if you ever need a reminder, you know where to find me," she said with a small laugh. "And I know this might sound crazy, but sometimes stepping away helps. Even just for a little while." Matthew smiled faintly, the idea of escape seeming foreign but strangely comforting. "I'll think about it. Thanks again." And as he set the phone down, a small part of him believed that maybe, just maybe, there was still hope for everything he was fighting for. Lila's voice was soft, but the relief in it was unmistakable. Matthew nodded, a sense of calm settling over him as he processed the events of the night. He had seen a side of Lila that was raw and real, the worry for her sister that had kept her up and searching for help in the dead of night. It wasn't the polished exterior of the business world he was used to, but something far more human. "You've been through a lot tonight," he said quietly, his gaze meeting hers as she sat back down on the couch. "I'm glad I could be here." Lila gave a small, tired smile, though there was an edge of vulnerability in her eyes. "I didn't know who else to turn to. It's just me and Maggie. No one else really understands." Matthew could feel the weight of her words, the quiet isolation she had lived with. He was familiar with the idea of being alone, but this was different. It wasn't just the absence of others. It was the responsibility of caring for someone so deeply. "You don't have to do it alone," he repeated softly. "I'm here." Her eyes softened, and for a moment, there was silence between them. The air felt heavy with everything unspoken. But before either of them could say more, Maggie's voice floated from the other room, her call weak but clear. Lila stood, moving with the same focused energy that had carried her through the night, and Matthew watched her go. She was strong, in ways that went beyond the surface, beyond the quiet moments when she let her guard down. As she disappeared into the room with Maggie, Matthew couldn't help but feel something shift inside him. The battle with Victor, the mess of his personal life, it all still loomed large, but in this small apartment, in this moment, he saw a glimpse of something more, something he hadn't allowed himself to consider in a long time. The connection between him and Lila was quiet but undeniable, a tether that was beginning to form, however fragile. He could only wonder where it would lead, but for now, it was enough to know that they weren't alone in their struggles. As the sun began to rise over the city, Matthew found himself walking back to his car, his thoughts still swirling from the night. There was still so much to be done, and the fight with Victor was far from over. But somehow, in the midst of everything, he felt a strange sense of clarity. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't fighting just for himself. He was fighting for something, someone, that he wasn't ready to lose. And that made all the difference, she said, sitting back down beside him. "I think she'll be okay now." "That's good," Matthew said, his voice low. "You should get some rest too." She shook her head, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I'm too wired to sleep, but you've done more than enough. I don't want to keep you." Matthew hesitated, torn between leaving and staying. Finally, he stood, his movement slow. "If you need anything at all, just call me." "I will," she promised, walking him to the door. As he stepped out into the crisp morning air, Matthew felt a strange sense of clarity. The chaos with Victor and Charlotte still loomed, but for the first time in weeks, he felt like he'd done something that truly mattered. And as he drove away, Leia's voice echoed in his mind. "You're not alone." The words felt truer now than ever, and for the first time, Matthew allowed himself to believe them. The boardroom of Hayes Real Estate was quiet. An unnatural hush fell over the room as Matthew walked in. The usual hum of conversation among board members ceased, their wary eyes following him as he moved to the head of the long oak table. Margaret stood to the side, her expression tense but steady, a stack of folders in her hand. Matthew knew why they were uneasy. The rumors about the company's supposed instability had spread like wildfire, stoked by Victor's manipulative campaign. Some of the board members had started to waver, questioning his ability to lead. Today, Matthew needed to silence those doubts. He stood at the head of the table, his gaze sweeping the room. "Good morning," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I know there's been a lot of speculation lately, and I want to address it head-on." Margaret stepped forward, distributing the folders. "These are updated financials and projections for the next quarter. As you'll see, Hayes Real Estate remains solid. The restructuring has strengthened our foundation, not weakened it." The room buzzed with murmurs as the board members flipped through the documents. Matthew allowed them a moment before continuing. "What we're facing isn't about numbers or market trends. It's about perception. And that perception has been deliberately manipulated." His words hung in the air, and several board members exchanged uneasy glances. "Victor Reed has been targeting our clients, spreading false information about our stability to position his own company as a safer alternative," Matthew said, his tone sharpening. "But here's what he doesn't want you to know. His company is in far worse shape than ours." Margaret stepped forward again, pulling up a presentation on the large screen at the front of the room. "We've conducted a deep dive into Reed Holdings' financials. Their cash flow is severely strained, and they've been relying on short-term loans to cover operating costs. If even one major deal falls through, they'll face a serious crisis." The board members leaned forward, their interest piqued. "This isn't just a business strategy. It's desperation," Matthew said. "Victor is using smoke and mirrors to distract from his own vulnerabilities. But we're not going to let him undermine us any further." The murmurs grew louder, the tide in the room clearly shifting. Matthew could feel the momentum building. But he knew this wasn't the end of the battle. He needed to strike harder. I'm scheduling meetings with our top clients to reassure them of our stability and vision for the future, he continued. But I need your support. If we stand united, we not only weather this storm but come out stronger. The room fell silent again, but this time, the tension had eased. One by one, the board members nodded, their confidence in him visibly returning. Let's move forward, said Alan Grant, one of the senior board members. We trust you, Matthew. Margaret gave him a subtle nod, and Matthew felt a weight lift off his shoulders. For now, he had their trust, but the real fight was still ahead. That evening, Matthew sat in his office, the glow of the city lights casting long shadows across the room. His phone buzzed on the desk, and he picked it up, seeing a message from Charlotte. Can we meet? I need to talk to you. He stared at the screen, his chest tightening. He hadn't spoken to Charlotte since their tense conversation at the gala, but he knew this confrontation was inevitable. With a resigned sigh, he replied, My place, 8 p.m. Charlotte arrived precisely on time, her appearance as immaculate as ever, but her usual air of confidence was missing, replaced by something more hesitant. Matthew, she said as she stepped inside, her voice softer than usual. Thank you for seeing me. He nodded, motioning for her to sit on the couch. He remained standing, his arms crossed. What do you need? Matthew asked. She looked down, wringing her hands. I talked to my father again. He told me everything. Matthew's eyes narrowed. Everything. Charlotte nodded, her voice trembling. About the clients, the rumors, all of it. He admitted to trying to sabotage you, but he claimed it was just business. He said he was protecting our interests. My interests, and what do you think? Matthew asked, his tone sharp. She looked up at him, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. I think he was wrong. And I think I was wrong for not seeing it sooner. Her words hung in the air, heavy with regret. But Matthew couldn't ignore the months of doubt and betrayal that had led to this moment. I don't know if I can trust you anymore, Charlotte, he said quietly. Your father's actions nearly destroyed everything I've worked for. And you stood by and let it happen. I didn't know, she insisted, her voice breaking. Matthew, you have to believe me. I didn't know how far he'd gone. If I had, but you knew enough, Matthew interrupted, his tone cold. You knew he was meddling, and you chose to look the other way. That's just as bad. Tears streamed down her face now, and she made no effort to wipe them away. I love you, Matthew, she whispered. I've always loved you. Can't we fix this? Matthew looked at her, his heart aching with a mix of anger and sorrow. He wanted to believe her, to forgive her, but the trust between them was shattered, and he didn't know if it could ever be repaired. I don't think we can, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Charlotte let out a shaky sob, her shoulders trembling. For a moment, Matthew almost reached out to comfort her, but he stopped himself. This was the end of something that should have ended long ago. Goodbye, Charlotte, he said, his tone firm but not unkind. She stood slowly, her tears glistening in the dim light. Goodbye, Matthew, she said, her voice breaking. Then she turned and walked out the door, leaving behind an emptiness that Matthew wasn't sure how to fill. The next morning, Matthew met with Margaret to finalize their strategy against Victor. The meetings with clients were set, and the evidence of Reed Holdings' instability was ready to be presented. But even as he threw himself into the fight, his mind kept drifting to Leah. That evening, he found himself at the cafe again, the warmth of the familiar space drawing him in. Leah greeted him with a smile, her presence as comforting as ever. Rough day, she asked, sliding his usual drink across the counter. You could say that, Matthew replied, his lips quirking into a faint smile. But it's getting better. They talked for hours, their conversation easy and unguarded. And as Matthew watched her laugh, her eyes sparkling in the soft light, he realized something he hadn't allowed himself to admit before. Leah wasn't just a source of comfort. She was a reminder of everything he'd been missing. Kindness, authenticity, and a sense of home. And for the first time in weeks, he felt a flicker of hope that the battles he was fighting might lead him to something worth holding on to. But as the evening wore on, he couldn't shake the shadow of Victor's schemes or the weight of the choices still ahead. The fight wasn't over, and the stakes had never been higher. The grand hall of the prestigious Landmark Hotel shimmered with opulence. Glittering chandeliers hung high above the polished marble floors, and the air buzzed with the sounds of hushed conversations, the clinking of glasses, and the occasional burst of laughter. It was the annual real estate gala, a cornerstone event where the city's most influential players gathered to flaunt their success, forge alliances, and measure themselves against their competitors. Matthew stood near the entrance, his tailored navy suit immaculate, his posture exuding calm confidence. Yet beneath the surface, he was anything but calm. This night wasn't about mingling or exchanging pleasantries. It was the battleground he had been preparing for. Tonight, he would confront Victor Reed publicly and turn the tide of the narrative Victor had so carefully constructed. Margaret approached, her expression sharp and focused. "Everything's set," she said, handing him a sleek black folder. "I confirmed with the AV team. The presentation will be ready when you give the signal." Matthew nodded, clutching the folder tightly. "Good. And the board?" "They're on edge," she admitted. "Victor's been working the room all night. If we don't handle this perfectly, we could lose them." "We won't," Matthew said firmly, though his stomach churned with anticipation. As the evening progressed, Matthew watched Victor navigate the room like a seasoned predator. His smile was charming, his laughter disarming, but Matthew knew better. Victor wasn't here to celebrate. He was here to finish what he'd started. "Ladies and gentlemen," a voice announced from the stage, cutting through the hum of the crowd. "Please join us for tonight's keynote presentation, delivered by none other than Matthew Hayes, CEO of Hayes Real Estate." Applause paused, polite but reserved. Matthew straightened his tie, his heart pounding as he made his way to the stage. He glanced at Victor, who stood near the back of the room, his expression unreadable. "Thank you," Matthew began, his voice steady as he addressed the room. "It's an honor to stand here tonight, among so many respected colleagues and competitors. This industry has always been about more than just buildings and numbers. It's about trust, vision, and resilience." The crowd listened intently, their curiosity piqued. Matthew paused, letting the weight of his next words settle over the room. "Recently, my company has faced challenges that some have used as an opportunity to question our stability and integrity. Tonight, I want to set the record straight." He gestured toward the screen behind him, and a slide appeared, displaying detailed financial charts. "These are Hayes Real Estate's financials as of this quarter. As you can see, we remain strong with a clear plan for growth and stability. The restructuring we implemented was not a sign of weakness, but a strategic move to adapt to changing market conditions." The murmurs in the room shifted, skepticism giving way to interest. Matthew's gaze swept the crowd, landing briefly on Victor, who now stood motionless, his eyes narrowed. "But this isn't just about numbers," Matthew continued. "It's about the truth. Unfortunately, not everyone here tonight values transparency as much as we do." He clicked to the next slide, revealing damning data on Reed Holdings. Gasps rippled through the audience as the screen displayed evidence of financial instability, mounting debts, and unethical practices. "Reed Holdings," Matthew said, his voice cutting through the silence, "a company that has been positioning itself as a beacon of stability, while quietly hiding its own cracks. This is the reality Victor Reed doesn't want you to see." Victor stepped forward, his composure faltering. "This is outrageous," he barked, his voice echoing through the hall. "You have no right." "I have every right," Matthew interjected, his voice calm but firm. "You've spent months undermining my company, spreading falsehoods and manipulating clients. But the truth always comes to light, Victor." The tension in the room was palpable as the crowd turned to Victor, their expressions a mix of shock and curiosity. Victor opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, one of the board members from Reed Holdings stepped forward. "Is this true, Victor?" the man demanded, his voice shaking with anger. "Have you been hiding this from us?" Victor's silence spoke volumes. The room buzzed with whispered conversations, the tide clearly turning against him. Matthew stepped down from the stage, approaching Victor directly. "This ends tonight," he said quietly, his voice low enough for only Victor to hear. "You've built your empire on deception, and now it's crumbling. Walk away before you drag everyone down with you." Victor glared at him, his jaw clenched. For a moment, it seemed like he might retaliate, but then his shoulders sagged, and he turned away, disappearing into the crowd. The sight of his retreat felt like a victory, but Matthew knew this was only the beginning. Margaret appeared by his side, her expression a mix of relief and triumph. "You did it," she said softly. For now, Matthew replied, his voice steady but weary. There's still a lot to clean up. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of handshakes and reassurances. By the time Matthew left the gala, the weight on his shoulders felt slightly lighter. But as he stepped into the cool night air, he found himself thinking not about Victor or the company, but about Lila. He drove straight to the cafe, knowing it would be closed but hoping she might still be there. The lights inside were dim, but he could see her silhouette moving behind the counter. He knocked gently, and she looked up, surprised but smiling as she unlocked the door. "Matthew," she said, stepping aside to let him in. "What are you doing here? It's so late." "I needed to see you," he admitted, his voice quiet but sincere. She tilted her head, studying him with a mix of curiosity and concern. "Rough night?" He nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "But it ended better than I expected." They sat together in the quiet cafe, the smell of coffee lingering in the air. Matthew told her about the gala, about Victor's retreat, and the weight that had been lifted. Lila listened intently, her expression soft and encouraging. "You're incredible, you know that," she said when he finished. "Standing up to someone like Victor, it takes guts." "Maybe," Matthew said, his smile growing. "But I couldn't have done it without you." "Me?" Lila asked, laughing softly. "I didn't do anything." "You reminded me of what's worth fighting for," he said, his voice steady as he met her gaze. And that made all the difference. Lila's cheeks flushed, and for a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, the world outside fading away. Matthew didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. And for now, that was enough. The crisp morning air carried the faint hum of Chicago's bustling streets as Matthew stood on the balcony of his penthouse, his hands gripping the railing. Below, the city moved with its usual chaotic rhythm, a reminder that life went on no matter the battles fought above it. For the first time in months, Matthew felt a strange sense of calm, not from everything being resolved, but from finally confronting the truth. Victor was out of the picture. His schemes had been exposed, his influence diminished, and his credibility shattered. Hayes Real Estate had weathered the storm, with key clients reaffirming their loyalty after Matthew's direct intervention. Yet standing here now, Matthew couldn't ignore the feeling that his greatest accomplishment wasn't in salvaging the company, but in finding a new sense of clarity about his own life. His phone buzzed on the table behind him, pulling him from his thoughts. He walked over, glancing at the screen. It was Margaret. "Morning, Margaret," he answered, his tone lighter than usual. "Good morning," she replied, her voice tinged with a rare note of warmth. "Just wanted to give you an update. Reed Holdings officially filed for restructuring this morning. Looks like Victor's finally facing the consequences." Matthew nodded, a sense of closure washing over him. "Thanks for letting me know. By the way," Margaret continued, a hint of curiosity in her voice, "you seemed different at the gala last night. More at ease. Anything you want to share?" Matthew chuckled softly. "Let's just say I've got my priorities straight." "Good to hear," Margaret said. "I'll see you at the office." As the call ended, Matthew set his phone down and turned back to the view. Priorities. The word lingered in his mind, drawing his thoughts to Lila. She had been his anchor through the storm. Her unwavering kindness and strength reminded him of what truly mattered. He had spent so long chasing success, building walls around himself, that he had almost forgotten what it felt like to truly connect with someone. It was time to change that. The scent of freshly baked bread and coffee greeted Matthew as he stepped into the cafe later that morning. Lila was behind the counter, her hair tied back and a flour smudge on her cheek as she handed a customer their order. When she saw him, her face lit up with a smile that made his chest tighten in the best way. "Matthew," she said, walking over as the last customer left. "You're up early." "I could say the same about you," he replied, leaning against the counter. "Don't you ever take a break?" She laughed, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Not when there's work to be done. Besides, it's what I love." Matthew reached into his pocket, pulling out a small envelope and sliding it across the counter. Lila raised an eyebrow, her curiosity piqued. "What's this?" she asked, picking it up. "Open it," he said, his tone soft but insistent. She carefully tore open the envelope, pulling out a single piece of paper. Her eyes widened as she read it, her hand flying to her mouth. "Matthew, is this?" "It's a lease agreement," he said, his voice steady. For that space you mentioned downtown. The one you've always dreamed of for your bakery. Tears welled in her eyes as she stared at him. Her voice trembled. I can't accept this, Matthew. This is too much. It's not, he said, reaching across the counter to take her hand. You've given so much to everyone around you, Lila. Let me give this to you. She shook her head, her emotion threatening to overwhelm her. Why would you do this? Because you deserve it, Matthew said, his gaze unwavering. And because I care about you more than I've cared about anyone in a long time. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath as she looked at him, her tears spilling over. Then, with a small laugh, she stepped around the counter and threw her arms around him, holding him tightly. Thank you, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. For everything. Matthew held her close, his own eyes stinging with unshed tears. In that moment, he knew he had made the right choice, not just with the lease, but with opening his heart to her. Weeks passed, and the grand opening of Lila's bakery was a celebration unlike any other. The small downtown space had been transformed into a warm, inviting haven, filled with the smell of fresh pastries and the sound of laughter. Friends, neighbors, and even some of Matthew's colleagues filled the shop, their joy contagious as they sampled Lila's creations. Maggie flitted through the crowd, her energy restored and her smile radiant as she handed out cookies. Matthew stood by the counter, watching Lila interact with her customers, her face glowing with happiness. You've created something amazing here, he said when she joined him, her cheeks flushed from the excitement. I couldn't have done it without you, she replied, her smile soft. You would have found a way, he said, his voice full of conviction. You always do. She looked at him, her eyes shining with gratitude and something deeper still. Thank you. Matthew reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers. Lila, I want to ask you something. Her smile faltered slightly, her curiosity piqued. What is it? He took a deep breath, his heart pounding as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Gasps rippled through the crowd as he dropped to one knee, his gaze never leaving hers. Lila Hart, he began, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to break through. You've shown me what it means to truly live, to love without expectation, and to find joy in the simplest moments. I don't want to spend another day without you by my side. Will you marry me? Tears streamed down Lila's face as she nodded, her voice breaking. Yes. 1,000 times yes. The room erupted in cheers and applause as Matthew slipped the ring onto her finger and stood, pulling her into a kiss that spoke all the words he couldn't say. For the first time in his life, Matthew felt whole, complete in a way he hadn't known was possible. As they held each other, the bakery buzzing with celebration around them, Matthew knew this was just the beginning. Together, he and Lila would build a life filled with love, resilience, and the kind of happiness that no storm could ever take away. And for the first time, he felt truly at home.